Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Diana Sinton, the Executive Director of UCGIS, the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science. Welcome to the next in our webinar series for this academic year. Today, we're going to be hearing from two of my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati, Amy Koshoffer and Jennifer Latessa, and a colleague of theirs from North Carolina State University, Paula Figueiredo. They're going to be together talking about data management for GIS projects. It's at the top of the hour right now, and people are still actively coming in to the session. So I'm going to give people another 60 seconds or so to complete their logging into this platform, and then we'll get started right after that. As a reminder for all of the attendees, your microphones will remain muted throughout this session. If you have any questions for the presenters, and we encourage you to pose questions, please type them out into your question/chat space that your interface will provide you. We will be monitoring those questions, and at the wrap up of the formal part of the presentation, we will present those questions to the, share those questions with our presenters, and make sure that we allow adequate time for responses. If there are a lot of questions and we aren't able to finish attending to all of them before the top of the hour, we will compile those, we will present them to our three presenters, and we'll be able to follow up with responses to all those questions that the whole audience will receive via email. For those of you who have asked, yes, in fact, this session is being recorded, as are all of the open webinars that UCGIS makes available. And tomorrow you'll get an email link that includes the place where you can access the recording from. Okay, with that, I am now going to turn over the session to my colleague, Amy. Amy, I'm going to make you the presenter. And I'll mute my own microphone.
Okay, and I am now unmuted. So thank you, Diana. Again, my name is Amy Koshoffer, and I am going to moderate this webinar today. And click here to move my slides. So this is, I wanted to just mention that this webinar is co-sponsored by UCGIS, and they were kind enough to invite the association that I'm affiliated with, which is Research Data Access and Preservation Association, RDAP. And so we are happy to present this webinar jointly. This is the outline for the webinar. I'm going to introduce who the speakers are, and then we're going to break it down into 3 sections: working through a GIS project, which Jenny is going to present. I'm going to take it over and talk about when you take a project and go for a grant, how you would put together a good data management plan for that. And then Paula is going to give you some of her experiences going through the grant process and successfully securing an NSF grant. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. Okay. So my name is Amy Koshoffer. I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Data Services at the University of Cincinnati. I'm responsible for our GIS services, and I work to develop programming and strategic direction around data management, data preservation, open science, and research reproducibility. I have my master's in library science from Kent State and my GIS certificate from the University of Cincinnati. And I was very lucky to be a UCGIS 2019 Trellis Fellow. I'm very grateful for that experience, and a shout out to all of you who are going to Honolulu this year. You are very lucky to have that experience. You will have an amazing time. Jenny Latessa works for me in our data and GIS co-lab, and she is a student research consultant. She has been with us since May of 2017 and is a PhD student in the College of Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning. in the regional and urban planning program. She has expertise in GIS, in QGIS, ArcGIS, and other mapping tools, and she has worked with over 80 students, faculty, and staff in her time in the lab. And Dr. Figueiredo is a former colleague of mine from here at the University of Cincinnati, but is now at North Carolina State, where she is a part of the geochronological laboratories and applying optical simulated luminescence and terrestrial cosmogenic nuclides techniques to several research questions. Her main research themes explore active tectonics, neotectonics, tectonic geomorphology, and surface processes. And she has active research projects all over the world, a lot in California, focused along the San Andreas Fault and other faults in Nevada, and also in Portugal, which she used to call home. Okay, so click here. The object for our webinar today is to talk about good data management practices within the project, and then how to take those into writing a good data management plan and to draw from our real world experiences in GIS projects, and to take data management plans into an active state of data management planning throughout an entire process. As Diana mentioned, if you have questions, you can type them into the question box and we will answer them at the end of our presentations as time allows. And if there are other questions, we will follow up by email. Okay, so I'm now going to hand it over to Jenny to talk about working with a GIS project.
Thank you, Amy. As Amy mentioned, I work as a GIS or spatial consultant here in the University of Cincinnati Libraries. And to begin, I just wanted to start by mentioning the fact that when I work with consultees, I'm not always starting right at the beginning of a project with them. I'm usually working with them wherever they have a problem. So ideally, if a researcher starts with an idea, then we can begin with planning and documenting ways in which their data can remain organized and be used for reproducible or replicable research for the future. This doesn't always happen, but wherever I am, I try to jump in and start that process immediately if it hasn't already happened. We like to include instructions on how to do different processes for individuals in case they forget or need to repeat these steps later on for their methods or for their research. So that is something that we start right away and like to do immediately. But if someone is thinking for the future of their project, I've included here a GIS project plan that we also like to give people when they're starting to think about their project and their planning of their project. I also just wanted to mention one thing about processes being saved. In software, sometimes this is the case if you have a document or a map project that you're working on. If you don't, then the data won't associate the process that you've done with it. So this is also why it's a really good idea to start early and record steps for metadata throughout your process. Next slide, please, Amy. The next thing I like to think about is labeling. When I'm working with someone, the main objective is for the labeling to be concise, clear, and consistent. Usually, computer software will tell you if a rule is being invalidated, but it is important for you to work within the validity rules of the software and identify the files or attributes for a project in a recognizable way for you to use them in the future. Whenever you're using a labeling system, the most important thing that you can do is to keep it up. Don't let it slip, because it can really, really help you going down the line. And another idea is to model your naming or labeling convention off of a system that's already in use. I've included here USGS file naming convention, and I also have included other references for you if you're interested in the bibliographic portion. Next slide, please, Amy. Since I'm working with so many different people and different steps of their work, the structure of the folders can vary depending on how they set them up themselves. But typically what I like to do is I like to set up a raw data folder and a process data folder in two separate folders, all within one master or root folder to store all of the project materials. It's really, really, really important that you keep a raw or untouched original data folder separate. I cannot emphasize this enough. Even if you think changes aren't being made to a file, if you're working in one program, another program might be messed up by this. And another really important and great idea to do is back up. And Amy likes, and I also think, the 3-2-1 rule is the best. It's when you include at least 3 different copies of your work using at least 2 different mediums, you know, a cloud server or a hard drive in one physically, geographically separate location. This can be helpful in case you have a fire or you're locked out of your office, anything could happen. So it's really a great way to be able to keep your information preserved in case of an emergency. Next slide, please. Versioning is another way that we keep track of our data. It's up to you if you want to use a label 0 for your raw data, but it is very likely that you will want to indicate different versions of your processed data with a 1 or a 2 or a 3 at the end, just so that you can retrace your steps, or in case one of the processes that you're trying to do fails. And whenever you have a successful version that you'd like to keep, to record in your metadata what that process is so that you can remember what is what later. I also wanted to just mention that though it's not an official rule, you shouldn't use spaces and you shouldn't start any of your files with numbers. You should try to keep them short. GIS programs do not like long file names, which they'll normally tell you, and there are ways to be able to make them longer if you want. But starting with numbers or having long file names or spaces tends to cause problems, glitches, issues, crashes, things that you don't want to see in your project. So we advise against those, even though there's nothing officially written about that. And keeping your process data into separate folders is something that we often do too. If it's a very big project, some people like to do it by date, some people like numbers, whatever works for you. It's just a helpful way to be able to quickly manage and organize your data so that your folder does not become complete chaos. If you're working with a map document, you might want to keep that in the main root folder just for quick convenience and accessibility. But definitely when you're working with different process versions of your data, you're going to want to make sure that they're kept within folders themselves. Next, please. Your workflow is when you are trudging through your process, the idea, making sure that you're labeling everything specifically with names and versions. And if you are using a map document, I know sometimes people just associate data without actually saving them within a project file. It's really important that you are using them with absolute pathways with relative pathways instead of absolute pathways. This is really only an issue in ArcGIS. QGIS automatically saves these with relative pathways. But this will save you a big headache later if you decide to switch computers, or if the computer that you're using or used restarts and you lose your data. It's really going to save you a lot of time and headaches if you just go ahead and make sure that you're saving all of your data with relative paths. You can replicate your directory and your structure if you haven't saved things with relative paths in the past, and that will recreate the absolute path for you. But just as a best practice idea, it's a good notion to keep the files with relative paths. Okay, next please, Amy. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that there are different software options available for workflow projects, especially when using spatial data. So sometimes knowing different coding languages can be a really big advantage. Specifically, Python is helpful for ArcGIS and QGIS, but R also allows you to do a lot of spatial data projects and has its own language. I won't get too into it, but I just wanted to conclude with that in case you are looking to really make your work interchangeable, then knowing some of these coding practices is helpful for GIS projects. Next, please, Amy. And lastly, your work has value and interest to others. If you are able and allowed to share your projects, your data, then people probably most likely will like to use it. But I just would like to make sure that you're aware that people have different abilities when it comes to these projects. So if you can save your data along with metadata, README files, project-specific explanations, things of that nature, you'll probably save people a lot of confusion. And it also makes your preservation and potential impact of your future use of this data more likely, because people don't have to make so many different assumptions. And finally, I just want to say that going along with the fact that all of these different data formats are interchangeable in different softwares, it's also a very good idea, not only for preservation, but for application, for you to save different formats of your data so that someone could maybe pick up a piece of data and quickly use it with a different program without having to do conversions. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll turn the mic back to Amy. I'll be available for questions at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. So now I'm going to talk about when you want to take that project. A lot of people that come to us in the lab are not necessarily working on a grant-funded project, but there may be an opportunity or an interest in doing that. And so I'm going to talk about taking the idea of data management from a project into actually writing a data management plan. So in writing a data management plan, most funding agencies would require that you would cover 5 major areas. So when you're thinking about the project that you're going to be working on, you want to also be thinking about these 5 big questions. And as Jenny mentioned in the beginning, starting by opening up a file, text file, or using, in our case, the GIS project plan, you start that documentation. And if you have that documentation, it's really easy to write your data management plan. And then it's really easy to put that into action. So you want to cover these 5 areas. What data will be produced? What standards are you using to document the data? How will the data be protected, especially restricted data? How will the data be archived and preserved? And how will you facilitate reuse and access of your data? And as Jenny mentioned, this is a really growing field, and people are very interested in reusing and getting access to data that's already out there. So my advice when you're writing a data management plan is just be very specific. So GIS projects produce a lot of different types of data. Beyond the shape files and the map files, there are numerical tables that are being produced, images that are being produced, the README files, CAD files, a lot of them. So spell it out very specifically. We will produce, CSV files of this type of data. We really encourage people to use open formats that will facilitate this reuse. So using a CSV over something that's proprietary, like something from Excel, Microsoft Excel, using TIFF images over some proprietary software, just really encouraging to think about the future researcher that might want to use this work. Open format implies that it can be opened in many different programs. QGIS, we're really a fan of QGIS in our lab because it does allow us to open different kinds of formats in QGIS, but think about other softwares that might want to use this program, your data, and put it into an open format. And technology is changing, programs are adapting, so these practices will be evolving over time, but starting with what is the current open practices now will promote sharing and long-term access to your data, and it will increase your impact over time. Okay, so here's an example from the DART project about some language that people use. This is an amazing project, just a shout out to the creators of the DART project, and it's available for you to explore. They looked at what type of language is used in NSF grants, and here's an example of how to be very specific when describing the type of data. You can see, they are stating we are using ASCII files, MATLAB, unfortunately not open format, but that's what they're saying, and CSV. So it's very explicit in the language that's being used in the data management plan. And that's actually my biggest piece of advice, is be specific. So the next question about what standards are being used. Sometimes when you're applying for a grant, they will tell you you need to use this type of standard. So some examples are from the USGS, to use their metadata standards. They have a very nice checklist that you can go through, pretty extensive. But here's an example of the different types of schema. And I've included a few others down there with the links. The slides will be made available along with the video, so you can click on these different links and explore these different metadata standards. In the case if you are working, say, in an institutional repository, you can ask. Our institutional repository, which I will highlight later, uses a modified version of Dublin Core. So if you don't know, but you know where you're going to put the data, you can ask, and then you can include that in the data management plan. Again, GIS projects deal with all kinds of data. If you happen to be dealing with human subjects data in your project, you need to account for that. You can't do anything with human subjects data if it has not been consented. So as you're going through the IRB process, you will be asked to consider this and to think about the consent form that people would sign to participate in the project if it's restricted data. If it's been de-identified or aggregated in a way that individuals cannot be identified, then that is not considered any more restricted data. So this wouldn't apply. But you need to think about that. Thinking about what is the spatial resolution that is appropriate to protect the identity of people in the project. So these kinds of questions will be asked, and you would want to address this in the data management plan. Who's going to see this data? Is it a summer student who's going to be passing through the lab, or is it just a core group who are the main researchers on the project will only have access to it? So you would want to state that in the data management plan. And then if this project is going to be creating any intellectual property, you will be asked to specify that in the data management plan and say how that will be accounted for. I do want to mention that sensitive data has a shelf life. It's meant to be destroyed after a project unless you have designated that in your IRB protocol and in the consent form. And so you can only do what's been consented for. So if you want to keep data for a long time, put it in the consent form so that the participants of the study will know that that's what's going to happen to it. So the next question you would want to address is how will the data be archived and preserved? So again, thinking about open formats, where are you going to place these open formatted data? It could be into an institutional repository or something like that. And then do you have policies around how long you need to keep the data? At the University of Cincinnati, we have a 5-year policy. A lot of granting agencies have a 3-year policy, so our policy is longer than the granting agencies. You need to be aware of that. And then where do you want to share your data? the culture is changing, and if you put in a data management plan, we'll share as requested, you will get comments back about that. This is not the practice anymore. You need to be thinking much more long-term. So I suggest if someone comes to me that they seek out, if there's a subject-specific repository, that would be the best option. That's where other people doing similar research to you are going to go to look for your data. But if you don't have access to a subject-specific repository, or if you have financial considerations, possibly your institutional repository was a very good option. Okay. If you want to search for repositories, the Registry of Research Data Repositories is a good place to start. Another great place to start is to get in touch with your research and data services team, usually associated with your library, and the librarians in that group can help you. Okay. This is an example of an institutional repository. This is the University of Cincinnati's Scholar at UC, and it helps researchers accomplish that mission of preserving and sharing data. We accept data into our institutional repositories. Some institutions have it separated out where they have just a institutional repository and then they have a data-specific repository. Again, check with librarians in your group. They can help with the creation of metadata. And one thing that people are always looking for is to give the data that they need to share a DOI. At the University of Cincinnati, our repository used DataCite DOIs, and this allows us to give a permanent link to the data set within our repository. Libraries have been in the business of preserving and providing access to information for a very long time, and we are here to do that for research data through resources like our institutional repositories. In our institutional repository, we don't have a lot of examples of GIS data, but here's an example of one from our classics department. This is information about a dig site in Albania, and I was able to go into the repository, pull out the data, and reconstruct this map using QGIS based on the README files there. So you can see the example of some information given about the file. But here, oh, actually, it's the next one. In creating the README file, the researcher was thinking about helping his project be reproducible, and I was actually able to do that. So here you can see he included a README file along with the maps that are there, and actually this is the actual README file that he included. So by doing that, there's a documentation of the data that's in the repository. I'm able to access that data. I'm able to recreate it and use the data if I wanted to in a future project. Parts of a README file that are important. At the bottom, I'm giving you a link to a template from the University of Minnesota, and these are the areas that it covers. General contact information about who the data generator was, some information about sharing the data. If you have the DOI already created, you can put that into the README file. Information about the files that are included. So this is an instruction sheet on how to use the data. If there's any kind of information about how the data was collected, that would be included. And then data-specific information such as data dictionary to tell you what variables might be there. And also if there are missing pieces of information, some sensor went down or something like that, that kind of information would also be included in the README file. Okay. Again, you need to address the question of how will you facilitate access and reuse of your data. I've already highlighted that will share as requested is not a best practice. Not accepted will be dinged in your data management plan. So look for another option. The grant or the publishers that you eventually might put your article into may have special requirements. Think about those when you're writing your data management plan, and think about how you would do that, like providing permanent links to that. And the metadata is really, really crucial for people to be able to find your content. So putting that into thinking about a schema there as well. Okay. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paula so she can talk about her real experiences working in the GIS projects.
Hello, thank you for having me. So my name is Paula Figueiredo, and I'm a postdoc and I'm an early career scientist. Amy, can you please show the next slide? Whoops, all right. And I'm going to share with you the experience that I had writing a proposal for a National Science Foundation. So I'm a scientist and I have an idea, and I'm very used to write science and how to highlight the strengths on my idea and ask for funding. And I was successful before writing grants for other funding agencies. And NSF asked a data management plan. So this was the very first time I was introduced to this. And so I looked to previous successful proposals that were founded, and the data management plan was just 2 or 3 sentences. And this was what I did as well for the first time I submitted this. So I was not funded. I don't believe it was because of the way I did the data management plan. They highlighted other points that I needed to improve. But regardless, I understood that there was something that I needed to improve. Next slide, please. So trying to get a successful proposal, you look for workshops, and there are several of them available, and you can look online and you can also talk with researchers that have been successful. And there are offers on this. In your institution for sure, in several other universities, there are always workshop available. They failed to explain to you what a real data management plan should be in most cases. So I had to do this, I had to learn, and I was at the time at the University of Cincinnati, and I searched for tools to learn how to do it. And I attended a workshop that Amy gave, and then I learned what a data management plan is. And instead of 2 or 3 sentences, I actually wrote a decent one, at least 2 pages, and explaining everything that I was doing already, but I didn't knew that I had to explain and prepare files this way to be available for everyone else. So this was my big learning experience. I actually think it was positive because I didn't took that bad experience as a waste of time. I learned from it. And next slide, please. So I resubmitted and I actually got funded. I also don't think it was because I wrote better and improved data management plan. I improved other aspects of the proposal, but for sure, I got really good reviews on the data management plan. And so I got the funding, I'm starting research, and now I'm actually running the data management plan and preparing it with all the people that is involved in the project. So my colleagues, researchers, and the students. So this is another new step. It's another learning sequence because we need to train everyone to prepare files and everything that Jenny and Amy mentioned before. People need to be aware of this because at the end of everything, when you need to share your data, things will be already prepared and done in the better way possible. And with this, I will take questions afterwards, and I'll hand it back to Amy.
Okay, thank you, Paula. And I do really want to give a great shout out to Paula for participating in this webinar and for sharing her experiences. She is a very, very busy researcher, and I really appreciate that she joined us today to take this time. So in conclusion, my advice that I give to researchers is kind of following up what Jenny said and what Paula has said, is to document all of your steps. Open up that text file at the beginning, start documenting, and be very consistent and specific about the language that you use in the data management plan, and to try to put that into action. And so as you are planning and planning and planning and then write the data management plan, like I said, the data management plan should almost be secondary to the work that you're already doing on a daily basis. And I can't say it enough, document, document, document. And also, you may need to adjust the plan Paula's experience speaks to this because she did move from one institution to another. And so moving from University of Cincinnati to NC State, she has different resources available to her. And so there may be changes that need to be put into action to help the plan evolve. So Jenny had mentioned some resources that we collected together so that you can explore these at your leisure after this webinar. Again, really shouting out to the DART project for language that's available, and some other good articles about managing GIS data through projects. Okay. And we are happy to take questions. This is our contact information. You can email me and Jenny directly at askdata@uc.edu. Or if you have a follow-up question for Paula, you can do it through her NC State email.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Amy, for that. Very much appreciated. And Amy, you might want to keep your mic, feel free to keep your mic on right now. I think we'll be going back and forth with some questions. If anyone else, a few people have begun to type in questions into your interface. Please feel free to do that. You can be as general or as specific as you like. And we will turn to these as we can. I've got one right now. Let me see, let me open up my screen so I can see this a little more carefully. We know that a proposal, I'm just going to be paraphrasing some of these, a proposal's data management plan is more than an executive summary. How do you encourage research groups to have more detailed and regularly reviewed data management plans for their group or their team? And I think you touched on this a little bit, Amy, with some of the different types of practices that you and Jennifer work with in the libraries there. But if you could comment on how I think that that's important about two important things there: encouraging them so that it's some incentives to do that, and then to have your plans be more detailed and regularly reviewed.
Yeah, so I will say that we are lucky when we can meet the researchers at their different places. And if they're working on a project, we really try to encourage someone on the research team to be what I would call the data sheriff. So that would be someone who takes this on as their responsibility to check in with people, to make sure people are using the practices. But we also need to see a transition in, say, a community of practice where people would say, this is the way things are done here at the university. You know, we document our processes, we put content into the repository. And I also like to get to what motivates someone. So what are the incentives for doing something? And a lot of researchers, they're interested in expanding the, scientific knowledge or the knowledge in their field. But at the end of the day, it does all come down to that you need to have impact in your field, especially say if you're faculty who may be going up for tenure. And the more you can get, impact in your field, the stronger your dossier will be. So I try to encourage people to think about what do they get out of something. I don't meet with research groups to check in on, are you implementing your data management plan? I've not been given that role in research groups, but I would really encourage them to think about, being able to have that long-term impact, finding the incentives for them. I mean, it could even be, if we meet someone who's a PhD student, you are going to need to have this data in 5 years when you go up to present your final thesis. And if you can't find it, you will be spending 10 years here as opposed to 5. So trying to really get into what does someone get out of it. So I hope that addresses the question, and I'm willing to continue that conversation. But I'm really hoping that we form communities of best practice and that we help each other to figure out how to best preserve this very valuable research output that we are creating.
Those are good points. I think that trying to help people understand that there is a community of practice around this, and sometimes even with as much encouragement as you can provide, it's not until, unfortunately, something negative or bad happens, that people learn some of the hardest lessons. Here's a question. I'm gonna read the first part of it, and then the person is looking for things to keep in mind for a certain type of publication. My organization is in the process of publishing a curated bathymetric data package on Dataverse. We decided that the output was the most useful piece of the package, and the processed data files are over 1 terabyte. So they are saying that they suggest users request them if necessary. The raw data are available on our open repository, and processing steps are documented in the README. And they're wondering with maybe about anything that you might recommend that they keep in mind for that type of publication. I guess the characteristics are extremely large data. It's probably perhaps the most important or complicated thing about data like that. Any best practices for when you've got really large data that you want to make available?
Yeah, so this is something that's quite challenging for us here at the University of Cincinnati. I think we do the easy stuff really well, and data storage is a really big question that we're grappling with. There are institutions that have, big data librarians or people that focus on that. I'm thinking of University of Michigan as a place. So this may be a question that I would refer to my community of practice, the research data librarian community. The RDAP community is really strong, and I put these kinds of questions out to those people to ask, how are you managing big data and making it accessible? So I don't have a good answer because I don't have that capacity here at the University of Cincinnati, but I'm willing to follow up with my colleagues at these other institutions and find out about it. And I will say that, this maybe a hope of mine is that, other countries seem to be much farther along in this and creating more of national data repositories that people can deposit these kinds. We do have some for certain areas, but we don't have it for all kinds of data. And so I hope that we will get to that place eventually. But that's probably the best answer I can give right now.
Okay, yeah, I think that the need to understand very large data sets in this era of big data are increasingly problematic and need to be thought through with those ideas of best practices. There is no one single solution. Someone else has asked about the fact that with GIS projects you might have code being an element of it, and you had mentioned before the idea of using version control. How do you oversee that for this is kind of a general question for you with the range of students and faculty that you might be consulting with? Do you ever help them also appreciate what it means to do best practices of version control of code? Like teach them how perhaps to use GitHub or other services like that effectively?
Yeah, so we do offer workshops on GitHub and teaching students about that. Our institutional repository supports versioning, and I do encourage people to think about the code. That would be part of the README file. That kind of information could be put in the README file. What version are you using? What of what program? And I mean, Jenny deals with that a lot in when she's working with teaching the QGIS workshops and the fact that the version of that software changes. And so trying to document, that the data is being generated by this particular version of the code is necessary and would go into the README file. I will also say that this is another component of that data storage part. We are seeing, the creation of capsules for data. Again, I'm seeing it in the commercial areas. Other colleagues may have access to this kind of support at their institutions, but a capsule would be where you put data and code and all of the dependencies of the code together, so that if you needed to run the data, you are using exactly the same version of a software to do either the analysis or the visualization of your data. And so that's a way to go. I'm thinking of something of like CodeOcean is an example of that, but that's a commercial product and not everybody has access to that. I'm also starting to see that publishers do require that sometimes. So if you are making code available, or if you're making data available and you wrote code to it, they may ask you to put it in a capsule and store it somewhere. So you may have to go to a resource like CodeOcean, or you have to document how to do that in your README file. So teaching about the practices through workshops on GitHub, teaching about how to write a good README file, using the templates, these together would help you with those best practices.
Okay. And then also the idea that you can have with things like GitHub, you can have you know, the versions can have their own DOIs and then their own citable references too, for people to pay attention, be thinking about the code that you're publishing in similar ways to other types of things that you publish.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. I didn't mention that, but yeah, that's exactly a good point. So.
Right. Here's a new question. Any suggestions or example sites or that you might share or best tools and practices for when you have not just large data sets themselves, but the whole projects that might be really quite large once you have all of the different zip files, tar files. So kind of managing the whole collection, not just best practices for large data. Any ideas about that? Maintaining external archive manifests?
So I'm a really big fan of the Open Science Framework. And this is a place where a resource put out by the Center for Open Science. And I have seen very large projects with multiple institutions involved, multiple collaborators, putting out their content and putting the architecture of the project out so that people can see how things are linked. And so this would be a place to do it. The nice thing about the Open Science Framework is that it allows for third-party add-ons. So if you are storing your content, say, in a cloud storage like Box, you can attach Box to it and have people link directly to your content through Box. And they're working on a OneDrive add-on, which this is what we have at the University of Cincinnati. And Google Drive can be attached as well. So the Open Science Framework allows for that, for people to be able to build a very complex architecture for projects within this tool. So that would be one suggestion that I would have.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, when people are pursuing a project that expects to have a web interface, a web component to it, where others would access the project overall, do you have any best practices that you recommend when people are creating things that are going to be web-based?
So you mean for the actual project, or because I mean the like the repository, it almost has like a platform that people put content into.
I was thinking actually
so,
this has to do with a question about using something, you know, platforms that are gonna, yeah, I'm thinking about accessing the project itself. Like if somebody is creating some website, for example,
okay.
What kind of guidance do you give to people for, I'm thinking also of long-term preservation, but you had talked before about, you raised a couple of important things that are affecting science these days overall, which is replicability and reproducibility, and being able to preserve access to things, not just from the back end, but the front end as well. So I'm just wondering what kind of things you ever advise people when they're envisioning designing a website that's going to serve as the front end of something.
Okay. So I haven't had that experience because, like I said, I've been using mostly pre-formatted tools. So if somebody's putting content into our repository, it already has an interface to it. Mm-hmm. This would be something that I would probably reach out to my RDAP community and ask them about. So at this point, I don't have a good answer for that, but I can
Okay.
follow up with that question.
Can you say something a little bit about RDAP?
Sure. Um, so RDAP, it used to be only a summit, but we have, I think that we reached a critical mass of people interested in having a professional society to come together to think about these challenges of big data and, like you're saying, maybe how people access information. And over the past 2 years, we have been moving from the summit to putting together architecture to be a professional society. And
And
we
RDAP stands for?
Research Data Access and Preservation Association. And so if you just search RDAP Association, it'll come up, and we have a website which highlights our mission statement. We have board coming together, talking about how to respond to all of the requests for proposals or information in terms of there have been a lot of calls from agencies about how do we deal with public access to data, how do we deal with how the NIH thinks about sharing data. There have been a lot of calls, and so we come together as a community to put together ideas to respond to these calls. We are also going to have a summit in about 2 weeks in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we'll be coming together. This will be our second conference as an independent organization. So,
Nice.
and we invite people. I don't want to say that this is a librarian conference. It's a information professional, people dealing with data conference to come together and talk about how to build a community of best practices.
Mm-hmm. All right. We still have a few more minutes where we could get to questions. If you have one and you haven't posed it yet, this would be a great time to do that. I have another question here about, do you find it challenging to talk with people about the metadata side of GIS data that they need to keep track of with regards to the spatial reference system? Say any of the data related to the you know, how you record the spatial reference of a particular data set, you know, whether it's projection information or coordinate systems or whatever it might be. Is that something that you that you've ever had to deal with directly with people, as they either, actually it has to do with either collecting their data or managing it and making sure that all the correct information is provided?
So I think this is a place where Jenny deals much more with this than I do, because she actually works with people as they are thinking about how to visualize the data. So what kind of projections, and doing the analysis where this is going to be very critical to make sure you're recording this kind of information. So Jenny, can you talk about if you've had any experience with that?
I would just like to say I would love it if people included that information inside of their metadata. It's one of the biggest challenges if you have downloaded or found some data that is perfect for you, you're just not sure what projection it is or coordinate system it's using. There aren't really a lot of reliable, good tools out there for you to be able to identify other than guess and check. It usually doesn't work well, but sometimes you do get lucky if you have some clues. Of course, you can look and see information about projection and coordinate systems if you do download data and it is embedded into the data. So that's an option, but it's good to know that information just generally and especially before downloading data. So I would encourage, emphasize, and hope that users would include that information in their metadata.
Okay, so pretty much a critical piece of information. I mean, it could be sensitive depending on the nature of the data. You know, not just for humans, but I know that I've worked in situations where the very accurate latitude, longitude coordinates of some plant species had to be both preserved from a data collection perspective, but also kept protected because of the nature of those particular species that didn't really want to distribute it. So that's just another characteristic of geospatial data that may need to be considered. And I think a complicating thing is when you're writing a data management plan to keep all of those pieces together. And I know you mentioned, you referenced all these important points before, but things about confidentiality and how going forward over the long term, you need to be able to both allow access when it's appropriate and possible, and also keep the protection in place.
Yeah, I think that that's been something that, you know, in thinking about the human subjects data, that's why you're trying to protect individuals, but it does apply to sacred sites. You know, I referred to the classics department and the type of, they may have finds that they want to protect the identity or the location of it. And you talk about, you know, for endangered species as well. So yeah, that can be tricky. I think we want to share as much as we can, but we also want to do no harm.
Right.
Right.
So last call for any questions. I have one more thing I wanted to point out, but as I'm saying this, please, if you've got another question, feel free to share it. Someone, Chantel Risdale, had put into a question that the University of California has a DMP, a data management plan tool for researchers to use. So I carefully used the internet behind this screen and did a quick Google search for this. And I have found dmptool.org. So again, I Googled University of California data management plan tool, and this is obviously what came up first. So if you're not familiar with this, this is new to me, and I look forward to exploring this further after the webinar. But their landing page here says, build your data management plan and welcome to the DMP tool, create data management plans that meet institutional and funder requirements. So it looks like
this is an excellent resource, and we have a institutional instance of this, so that if somebody wants to, we can send them to this tool. They can log in with their University of Cincinnati login and access, and there you can look at tools, at plans that have been made open. You can use a wizard to create a data management plan. And it's going to ask pretty much the same 5 questions, but it's going to do it using the text directly from the grant. So you can pick the agency that you are working, that you want to apply to, and use a template based on that agency's requirements. It still means that you have to understand the question that's being asked. So like the NSF questions are pretty long. And so think about what is the question really trying to get at? And that's pretty much the 5 questions that I put out in the beginning of my part of the presentation. But this is an excellent resource, and I refer people to this as well.
Great. Maybe we can add it to the list and the resources before we publish the slides.
Yes, I will do that, yeah.
And then also Sarah Jenkins has added another comment about, she says that they use Portage Network for DMP creation in Canada. Also draws from the templates with the 5 major data issues that Amy covered earlier in this webinar. So Portage Network for DMP is another one.
Yeah, so if I'll try to get the URL and put that one in the slides as well.
Super.
So,
all right.
We do have a lot of members from Canada in RDEP.
Okay. We are coming up to the top of the hour. I want to thank our 3 presenters very much, Amy, Jennifer, and Paula, for sharing your experiences today and these good ideas, whether it's for a proposal that you're writing, or whether it's just communicating with your peers or teaching your students the best way to do things to go forward and make sure that data management is happening effectively. We know how critical it is in the world of GIS and beyond that in all dimensions of science, but very important for GIS teaching and learning. So again, everyone, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our speakers. We're going to wrap up the webinar now, and you will get a link tomorrow in an email that includes a recording. Feel free to share this with the broader community. And thank you, everyone, for sharing an hour with us today.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Paula. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Jennifer.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.